Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, we're talking to Agrii's Tom Land, Fertiliser Technical Manager, and Tom Perrott, Crop Input Specialist. Today, we're asking a key question. What do we need to be thinking about when it comes to autumn nutrient planning for the winter cereal crop, so that when it comes to harvest time, we can see a profitable return on our investment? So, good afternoon to you, chaps.
Good afternoon, Tony.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Tom Land, if I can start with you first. Where do we start when it comes to thinking about autumn nutrition for the crop that we are about to sow?
Well, it's a great time to do one of two things, really, which is take a retrospective look back at last season and see what the good successes were. I think farmers are pleased with yield responses from last season. Although we had challenging weather conditions, yields were there and very provided some great returns. And I think it's worthwhile looking back and looking at, did the farmer make any cutbacks on nutrients last season because of maybe the financial situation, and what sort of differences in either yield or grain qualities have they picked up from the previous crop? It also then helps us think about, well, we're now about to start planning for the autumn and the crop we're about to sow. One thing being, how much residual nitrogen have we got left in our soils? Well, a lot of soils haven't received a lot of rainfall yet, so there probably is a reasonable amount of residual nitrogen there. So establishment may be good depending on soil conditions, and how can we, capitalize on that through the season? And what other nutrients have we got in the soil from recent soil analysis, for example?
Sure. And you talk about soil analysis. How much data can we glean from the previous crop that's going to help us plan for this approaching crop?
Well, obviously the soil analysis is your basis, your starting point. I'm a big fan of grain testing. I think it does give you the ability to calculate a nitrogen use efficiency figure, where you can take the N offtake in the grain and relate that to the nitrogen you applied out of the bag, and the nitrogen that was in the soil, either through a soil mineral nitrogen test or the RB209 SNS values you calculate using book values. So it's a good calculation to do, just to see what N recovery rates were like, because it can also feed into things not just nitrogen related, but soil structure, any limitations with the plant's ability to access nitrogen from the soil, really.
And that sounds a really good investment in that analysis, Tom. So how many farmers do that?
I think it's growing. It's certainly growing year on year. When I look at Agrii's database of samples, we seem to double our number of samples every year, which is great. We do a lot in trials, so we use those results to help see if we see any differences in nitrogen responses, particularly where we may be reducing N rates. What effect it has on the grain is usually quite a good indicator of, have we cut nitrogen back too far, for example. And this year we've also started to do more straw testing. Just to kind of get an understanding in a year like this year, are more nutrients, particularly potassium, maybe getting trapped in the straw, and if they're being baled and removed, then we're obviously losing them from the ground, but if they're being chopped, they're being obviously returned to the ground as well, really.
And Tom Perrott, to bring you in here, you're a crop input specialist. That's what you do. How much can we learn from last year that could be useful for deciding on where we spend on nutrients for this coming crop?
I think the proof is in the pudding, isn't it, really, that all businesses that we're in discussion with have had, good yields, and they applied, the suitable nutrition to grow those crops last year. You can go around quite a few farms and see the sheds are full. There's been some adequate opportunities, I think we'll modestly put it, for the grain market. So yeah, I just think on the whole, what we've learned is that nutrition is key. Tom's right that taking a soil sample, I always say if you start off with a good foundation, the rest will come true. And nutrition, soil sampling, and growing a crop is very much case in point of that saying.
And to both of you really, what are the risks that we saw last year with? I'm thinking about the weather pattern actually, that dry spring and the hot summer. But what are the risks that we have to be mindful of in terms of making sure we've got good crop resilience going through to harvest next year? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I think last season was a good case in point. I think we had a lot more solar radiation, so the crop's ability to photosynthesize maybe was better, which also helped with yields, specific weights, nitrogen utilization as well, for example. And I wonder if I was worried about what effect the dry weather might have had on crops, but certainly on well-bodied soils and things like that. We didn't see any too disastrous problems with the dry weather, particularly on winter cereals, for example, who that had a robust root system and could manage themselves quite happily, really.
So you're talking about that robust root system. Tom Perrott, is that the key to it, that we've got to really make sure that the crop sets off on a good footing, so to speak, so that it does have the resilience?
We know from looking at numerous trials that we've done as a company, things like starter fertilizer, getting that nutrition right is always very good at setting the crop up well. We know that phosphate's a key element as well in trying to get crops to place their roots down far enough. We know that placement fertilizers also have a benefit through some of this modern technology. And the more you keep adding these little details onto how you develop a crop, you're basically treating each step as an insurance policy to growing a successful crop. Obviously, Mother Nature can have the last laugh with us all, but actually getting the rooting structure, getting the fertilizer in place to help the crop absorb the water better, and it's all stepping stones of building up an insurance policy to get to your end goal.
Yeah, sure. So, Tom Land, let's just come back to you there. So I know you've been busy travelling around the country, sharing your expertise with growers. What should growers be thinking about right now? Where should their mindset be when it comes to this nutrient planning?
Yeah, I think, like we said at the start of our discussions, it all starts with the soil sample and understanding where we've got the previous crop. Now it's a case of trying to identify, are there any limiting factors that we might see within that crop over the year, depending on the soil status, really. So it's worth looking at and identifying, phosphorus levels. Obviously, the autumn is a key time for applying phosphorus to see a response from phosphorus applications. We still see responses to fresh phosphate on soils that are index 1. So I still see that as a really important factor to consider, that a grower might not necessarily like the price of triple superphosphates at the moment, but if he's on a phosphate deficient situation, there still is a yield response and a response from utilizing fresh pea in the seedbed. Yes, you can play about the rates and place it down the spout in direct drills and do a whole host of things, but we still see responses in trials in that situation, really.
Yeah, and Tom P, you mentioned that something that you've picked up from looking back over last year is really touching on the point that Tom Lamb made there about price, that sensitivity to that fear of spending, that those big costs that a farmer is getting involved in when buying in these nutrients. So I think you had a bit of a saying that it's almost Shakespearean, Tom P. What is your saying?
Certainly, what we've come out with the trials is, when you're talking to growers, that in today's society and environment and pressures that we're under in agriculture, less needs to be more now. There was a time where we used to take a variety, stick it into trials, see how much nitrogen we could put on it before, say, spring barley nitrogen levels went pop and it was too much. Now we're literally dropping, one little granule of urea onto the plot and seeing just how well we can utilize every little part of that nutrient and how well we can get that plant to utilize it, and also how we can understand the relationship between the soil, the nutrient, and the plant, and getting that all focused. So certainly in a very short amount of time, the industry has sort of done a U-turn on looking at how we can use this nutrition.
Sure, and there's some very valuable aspects of that in terms of, towards net zero and thinking about our environment, isn't there? But what you're really saying, and your quote, in case anybody missed it, is less needs to be more. That's your quote, which is really interesting because it makes you think, doesn't it? So Tom Land, how do we strike that balance? How do we get that balance right that helps the farm business and its sustainability and its profitability, but balances that with what the crop needs? What's new for us to think about there?
What's quite topical at the moment is there'll be a lot of growers going out into fields this autumn, taking soil samples, and for the first time, maybe taking a soil organic matter test. Under the SFI, we're seeing growers, taking soil organic matter tests, and there's probably two main tests in the market that you can do for soil organic matter. But I think that brings a huge amount to the party for the grower who's maybe doing this for the first time, but also is using it in relation to, well, how do I take this result, and how does this influence how well phosphate can be managed in the soil, potassium, for example, and other elements. So I think growers are starting to get more data coming in, and the organic matter piece, I think, will bring a lot to the party. Not just understanding where you are now, but where you might go on your journey into the future, possibly.
Sure, and you've mentioned phosphate 2 or 3 times, Tom. So tell us a bit about your product release. How's that different, and how can it help the grower?
Yeah, well, we've been working with a series of products over a long time, actually. So we started playing with fertilizer coatings. So we've had a product in the market called P Reserve, which is a coating you apply to phosphate fertilizers, and it basically works to keep the phosphate soluble for longer. So it neutralizes elements that potentially lock up the phosphate that the plant can't access, particularly elements like calcium and aluminium, for example. And then alongside this, we've been actually just applying the product to the soil in the absence of phosphate fertilizers, because we know we've seen responses to it in these situations, but now we've started to really ramp up trials work and R&D, particularly in a situation where people aren't applying phosphate fertilizers, but want to get some sort of response from the soil's nutritional value, really.
Sure, and the big question, does that have a financial benefit to the bottom line for that particular crop?
Well, it does if you look at the sheer cost of it, because release is probably £28 a hectare, and bagged phosphate fertilizer, depending on what rates you apply it at, could be anything up to £80-90 a hectare. And I'm certainly not saying that it's a direct replacement for bagged phosphate fertilizer, but it's certainly a useful tool in terms of either helping increase the availability of fresh pea when the plant needs it most, which is the establishment phases of growth, and then it may either help you as well if you're on a more optimal soil type and you're just wanting to kind of carry yourself along a bit longer until you can see more realistic phosphate prices in the future.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is that it's easy for a grower to go, well, in terms of what my nutrient planning is going to be about this year, I've done this, I've taken that approach, it's worked in the past, which is very, very valid. But what it's also saying is we've got to learn from the immediate past, the last crop with your grain testing, and also looking at other ways. And there are other ways. And the example you're just giving there, Tom Land, is a very cost-effective way forward in terms of phosphate. What other things can growers be looking at or thinking about that could really help them with their planning over the autumn?
The easiest thing is soil structure. That's going to be a really challenging one at the moment for growers who've come out of a very dry period. Some are fortunate in getting rainfall at the moment, but soil structure plays a huge role, not just in the establishment of the crop, but also in the crop's ability to extract nutrition from the soil over its life, over its growing life, really.
Yeah, sure. And we learnt that from Regen. If any of you went to that event, but if you didn't, you can catch up on some of the highlights on Tramlines right here, actually, where we interviewed some farmers who've been going through that Regen transition. And it was a key thread, a key theme of what they kept saying, which was that, there is a huge benefit to be gained from looking after your soil in a slightly different way, financially and in terms of nutrients. Tom Perrott, I mean, as an input specialist, what would you like to add to the mix here about what growers should be thinking about?
I think from a nutritional point of view, if we're talking about, Tom's spoken about, getting the soil right, getting that foundation set up. I think the other part of the whole aspect and the environment that we're in now is that farmers perhaps need to start considering alternative products. So if, for example, they were, traditionally using a nitrogen sulfur compound, perhaps the market might present a slightly better solution for their business if they were to consider something like a straight ammonium nitrate and polysulfate, or a protected urea and a sulfur. And I think it's about having that open-mindedness about how you can solve that nutritional problem, still get the product on farm, still get the right nutrients for that crop to grow a successful yield, and just keeping a bit more of an open mind and understanding that sometimes these products don't always have to, they can take them out of their sort of comfort situation, if you will, and put them into a more useful scenario.
Most of those sound to me as if they're soil applied. What about the foliar applications? Is the mileage in that approach?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that, more growers are looking at those kind of options, particularly around possibly foliar nitrogen, for example. And I think growers have a lot of questions in terms of, A, how do you get the best out of these types of products, but also B, where do you position them within your traditional fertilizer timings and applications, really.
Sure. And Tom Land, I mean, in terms of, that nasty word availability, but should growers still be adopting the great advice that you gave earlier this season, or last season, in fact, about thinking about what do they have in stock, what do they need, and really planning ahead rather than leaving it to the last minute? Is that a key element of making sure you've got what you need for your plan for that crop?
Well, particularly where nitrogen fertilizers are concerned, then yes, if you have a particular favorite source of nitrogen fertilizer, then the markets are getting more challenging. We're seeing shortages of supply or shortages of product choice coming into our markets. We're certainly seeing more urea potentially coming into the UK market, and urea levels and use on farm has increased. But also alongside that, we've seen the increase of interest in inhibitors for granulareurea, which work to improve the nitrogen use efficiency, reduce ammonia losses from urea fertilizer. So the products we trialed many years ago on urea fertilizer, for example, are now starting to take a place in the market. We know that they work and that they do bring something to the party, but also they're enhancing the nitrogen use efficiency of the product along the way.
What top tip would you actually give growers to start really focusing on as they listen to this in their tractor cab, when they're cultivating, drilling, etc.? Tom Perrott, let's start with you. So Tom P, what top tips would you really urge growers to start thinking about, right now?
I think at the moment there are a lot of pitfalls to avoid. I think it's very easy to have phone calls, make knee-jerk reactions based around pressure selling or whatever it might be. I think taking a good, long, hard look at the market, going to your trusted individual, whoever that may be, getting the facts of the market, getting the facts of what's available to your business, rather than making that spontaneous or emotive response. Get the facts, get the right decision for your business. That'd probably be my one.
Thank you, Tom P. Great advice and really clear indeed. So, Tom Land, what would be your top tip for listeners to take away today?
Mine is the nitrogen use efficiency piece. I mentioned earlier, growers will be doing soil organic matter tests. There's a great opportunity to take a look back, understand what's happened. People are thinking very carefully about how much nitrogen they apply to their crops. The right thing to do is actually do a proper calculation and then look at it on a field by field basis, really.
Thank you, Tom Perrott and Tom Land, for, as always, sharing your valuable expertise and advice. Indeed, valuable insights as to what growers and farmers could be considering when it comes to their autumn nutrient plans for their winter cereal crops. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.